Good morning, everyone. This morning, we're going to take a look at one of the Psalms. And I know I don't do very many lessons from the Psalms, but this one is really beautiful, and I hope we all get a lot out of it. The Psalm 139. Psalm 139. Before we get into this, I want to give you a brief introduction to it. This is probably the longest text in Scripture that discusses the omnipresence, God's presence everywhere, and it's one of the greatest passages discussing God's omniscience, his characteristic of knowing everything. Now, as we get into it, I'm sure several of you are already sighing to yourselves, oh, why is he doing this again? He's going to get all philosophical and deep, and it will be too much for us. But I want to encourage you that if the psalmist encourages us to take a look at one of the characteristics, or multiple of the characteristics of God, that it would be well for us to heed that invitation. So, let us read the Psalm of David. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You understand my thought from afar. You scrutinize my path and my lying down, and are intimately acquainted with all my ways. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. You have enclosed me behind and before, and you have put your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain to it. Where can I go from your spirit? Or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. If I lift up the wings of the dawn, if I dwell in the remotest part of the sea, even there your hand will lead me, and your right hand will lay hold of me. If I say, surely the darkness will bruise me, and the light around me will be night, even the darkness is not too dark for you. And the night is as bright as the day. Darkness and light are alike. For you form my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in secret, and intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes have seen my unshaped substance. And in your book all of them were written, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was not one of them. How precious are your thoughts to me, O God. How vast is the sum of them. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. When I awake, I am still with you. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of bloodshed, depart from me. For they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do not I hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not revile those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They have become my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. Now, as we read through this psalm, you see repeated over and over these resonating thoughts of God's omniscience and his presence everywhere the psalmist goes. Now, I will note in the inscription, not all, but many of the Psalms have an inscription at the top. And this one says, a Psalm of David. Now, there are two possibilities as to what this means. It could mean that this is, in fact, a genuine Davidic psalm. David himself wrote this psalm. It could also mean that it was composed in the style of David's other hymns. I don't know well enough to say either way, but I noticed while studying this, the consensus seems to be that it actually was not written by David himself, but written during the exilic period, while the Jews were exiled and living in exile in Babylon, and it was composed in the Davidic style. That's not going to be terribly important, but we are going to bring that back up at a later point. And I want us to look at this really in 4 sections of 6 verses. It divides very, very evenly like this. The first section is kind of comprehensive. All of the thoughts that he's going to get into are really included in this first section. And so it's really more of an introduction than anything else. He describes here, he observes that God has known him. That everything he has done up to this point, that God has known, God knows about when he sits down, when he rises up, when he lays down, he goes for a walk. God knows everything. He knows what you do on a daily basis. He knows what you have done, the things that you have forgotten. Sometimes I may be talking with a friend or looking through old pictures, and you remember things that you've done. And you think, how did I forget that? I mean, maybe even years of your life that you look back on, and I kind of forgot those things happened. But God doesn't forget these things. God remembers these. God knows everything it is that you've ever done, both good and bad. God looks at your life and he sees it as a whole. And this is not just what has happened, but even those things that have happened in the past, God knew them before they happened. Look at verse 4. Even before there is a word on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it all. Everything that we say or that we do, even the things that we think, God is aware of these. Now, in verse 5, my translation puts this, you have enclosed me behind and before. You've put your hand upon me. And it almost sounds like God is, holding someone in. This comes out a little clearer in this translation by Robert Alter. From behind and in front you shaped me, and you set your palm upon me. And you can hear in this translation, it's really more a description of God forming man out of a lump of clay, like a potter. We see this same metaphor used in other passages. Job uses it in Job 10, verse 9. He says, remember now that you have made me as clay, and would you turn me into dust again? Isaiah talks about this metaphoric conversation between the clay and the potter, and God's superiority over us in that way. But the poet here uses this expression, and he concludes in verse 6, such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It is too high. I cannot attain to it. The things that God knows, this limitless, unfathomable knowledge, well, it's a good thing that God has that knowledge, because if any of us did, our minds would explode. We're never going to reach the full capacity of our human minds. But the things that God knows could never be contained in all of our minds put together. It's too high. It's too wonderful. And the poet here is filled with wonder and amazement, and he praises God for God's omniscience. Then we take a look at verses 7 through 12. And he begins to be a little more definite. Here he specifically focuses on God's presence. That God is always present. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, behold, you are there. He splits in verse 8 here. He uses two expressions. He says, if I ascend into heaven. Now, in our minds, when we speak of heaven, we're usually talking about the place where God is. This eternal, ethereal realm that is not part of space, that we can't ever access physically. But if you look at the way the ancient Israelites described the world, they would often describe heaven as being another layer of the sky, basically. So when it says heavens here, you probably shouldn't be picturing necessarily this far distant realm, but the sky. Basically, we've got the earth that we're on, and we've got the area where the birds live, and ultimately you go far enough where God is. Well, that's what happens when you go up. But what happens when you go down? Well, we read throughout the Bible of the realm where the dead go. After we die, our spirits are, of course, disconnected from our bodies, and our bodies just go into the grave, but the spirit has to go somewhere. And they use this word that we see here, Sheol, or Sheol, as we would say, Sheol, which refers to this realm. And they visioned or described this realm as if it was below ground. When we talk about the underworld, that's kind of how this is being described. That no matter how far up and away you can possibly go, you're never going to leave the presence of God. And no matter how far beneath the earth you go, you're still never going to get away from God. Whether you go so far that you're no longer in the physical world, but you go into the spiritual realm, God is still present there, both above and below. And then he, in the next four verses 9 and 10, and 11 and 12, he expands on both of these. Verses 9 and 10, if I lift up on the wings of the dawn, that is the east. If I don't know which way east is from here. I'm very direction. I guess it would be that way, right? Yeah, east. If I lift up on the wings of the dawn, and he describes traveling all the way across, and I dwell in the remotest part of the sea. Well, I know, I don't have a map, so if you have to turn to the back of your Bible to see a map, you remember that where Israel is positioned, to the west is the Mediterranean Sea, and the sea just continues and continues. You go past Spain, and it's still just more and more water. And it represents as far to the west as you can go. If I start on the easternmost part of the sky, and I lift up and I travel across the heavens and go as far west as possible, I'm never going to escape from God. I will still be in his presence. God is everywhere, all at once, which is something that we cannot even imagine. I don't know how many times I have wished I could be in two places at once. There's nothing more frustrating than taking a look at your calendar and realizing that you have double booked yourself. And both of these commitments happen to be really important, really, really critical. You can't really give either one of them up. But you're forced to make a decision because you can't be in two places at once. Well, God has never had to make such a decision. God doesn't decide things like that. God isn't limited by space and time. He can be everywhere all at once without ever having to divide his attention. The prayers that I offer, I don't have to worry that God is too busy to listen to them. If you and I are praying at the same time, God doesn't have to decide which prayer he's going to listen to. He can listen to them both with complete attention. And in fact, he can do that at the same time that he's healing a woman in Kenya and sending rain to a small town in northern Canada. This can all happen at the same time. God is not limited by these things like we are. And I want you to think of how much of a comfort that is for the author. Now, I said we don't know exactly who it is, but from either perspective, you look at David's life and how much of it was spent on the run. After being anointed and before becoming king, he was on the run pretty much constantly from King Saul, who wanted to dispatch him. And after he became king, he had a few years of peace until his son, well, actually multiple sons, until his sons tried to throw a coup and take over. And then he was on the run even from his own children. He spends all this time running away and hiding in caves and hiding in the rocks and the hills. And no matter where he goes, maybe he can hide from Saul and he can hide from Absalom, but he never has to worry that God can't find him. God is always present with him. God is always there to provide comfort and to encourage him, to build him up. If the psalm is a later one and is composed during the exile, I want you to think of the comfort it was to know that God was still with them, even though the temple was destroyed. Even though they were far and away, so far from their homeland, they were in a new land. They were surrounded by pagans. They were surrounded by people who worshiped their own gods. And yet God was still there. You know, in the book of Ezekiel sees this vision. And he envisions the glory of God departing from the temple, leaving the temple, and not coming back. God is present everywhere, but sometimes he is specially present. He was specially present in the temple, and he is specially present today in the church. But even when that special presence was taken away, and the Jews had to live in Babylon, apart from that, apart from the Ark of the Covenant, apart from the protection of God in the way that they had been receiving, God was still there. God was still in control. God still ruled in the kingdoms of men. And even today, where we may feel that God's presence it seems like he's not always there, it should give us hope and comfort, knowing that he is. Even though we cannot see him, we cannot feel him, cannot taste or smell God. There's no way to experience God with our five senses. But God's presence is not lessened because of that. Verses 13 through 18. God knows everything. For you formed my inward parts. Now, I have never seen any of my own internal organs. So a weird sentence. You know, we say no one knows us better than ourselves, right? You know, I know what I'm thinking. I know what I like, what I dislike. I know myself better than anyone else does. And yet, 99% of my own body I have never, ever seen. I've never seen my own brain. I've never seen my bones. I've never seen what the inside of me looks like at all. But God has seen every part of it. God was the one who formed my inward parts. He wove us together in our mother's womb. I will give thanks to you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, and my soul knows it very well. In verse 15, when it says, my frame, my bones, God was the one who assembled us together and intricately woven in the depths of the earth. I want you to look at verse 17 and 18. We've already seen this thought once, but the psalmist repeats it. How vast are your thoughts, O God? How vast the sum of them is. If I should count them, they would outnumber the sand. And when I awake, I am still with you. The translation that I referenced earlier renders verse 17, instead of how precious are your thoughts, how weighty are your thoughts. I want you to think about this. God's thoughts, God's knowledge is at once too high for us to attain. It is too great and too wonderful. And yet those thoughts are so deep and so heavy we could never carry them. And they are so numerous that if we even tried to count them, not even think them, if we just tried to count them, he describes that as he's counting, he becomes so weary with counting that he falls asleep. When he awakes, God's still there. God's still there thinking all those countless thoughts, all at once. One of my personally favorite authors, A.W. Tozer, wrote this about God's omniscience. Because God knows all things perfectly, he knows no thing better than any other thing, but all things equally well. He never discovers anything. He's never surprised, never amazed. He never wonders about anything, nor, except when drawing men out for their own good, does he seek information or ask questions. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine not knowing anything? That there's no piece of information that is outside your knowledge. How much of our life is limited simply by things we do not know? How much of our lives are dedicated to just finding out more information? We go to the doctor because we don't know. We hire contractors to work on our house because we don't know. We get an education because we don't know. We read because we do not know. Even the fact that we have conversations with one another is evidence that we do not know. Our entire existence is built around not knowing really much of anything. We really don't. Our minds hold so little information, and yet God knows everything. And how is it that somehow we manage to get this flip-flopped, and we sometimes are able to convince ourselves that we know better than God does? That our way is better. That if I live my life the way I want to live my life, and if I talk and I act and I think and I speak like I want to, things are going to somehow turn out all right, even though God has said something else. How do we convince ourselves of that? And yet, that's exactly what we do. Now, I said this is one of the greatest texts on God's omniscience. I think the only one I would say is stronger on God's omniscience is the end of the book of Job. In the opening of the book of Job, the man Job is struck with numerous calamities. His children perish. His home is destroyed. His entire substance is lost. He loses the ability to conduct business, to provide for, well, he only has his wife left. All of his servants are dead. Everything he has is completely lost. On top of that, his health is taken away, and he is, all of a sudden, he's afflicted with this terrible disease that incapacitates him so much he can't even move. He's not even bedridden because he can't even lie down. He just sits and scratches and scratches. This horrible disease. And as the book goes on, he has this long conversation with a few of his friends. And they start coming up with theories as to why this is all happening. Now, Job's friends they're just convinced. They just know it. That the reason this all happened is because Job, he's a wicked man. Clearly, God has struck him with these things because of his wickedness, and God is pronouncing judgment upon him. But Job says, I've done nothing wrong. I'm completely innocent. And both of them make these extreme conclusions and statements. And at the end of the book of Job chapter 38, verse 1, says that the Lord appears in a whirlwind, and he actually responds. Now, the Lord doesn't actually give Job an answer. He never tells him why all these things happen. He never gives him the rest of the story that he wanted. But he challenges Job. In verses 4 and 7 of Job 38, God asks Job, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you know understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?" Verses 22 and 23. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail, which I reserve for the time of distress, for the day of war and battle? Verses 31 through 33. Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the cords of Orion? Can you lead forth a constellation in the season and guide the bear with her satellites? Do you know the statutes of the heavens, or fix their rule over the earth? Sometimes we forget that we're not the only parts of God's creation that he watches over. All of nature, all of the planets and the stars and the galaxies and the nebulae and everything that exists, God is in control of all of it. And I certainly have no idea how any of it works. And God knows every detail. And so, the psalmist concludes. Now, verse 17 here begins so abruptly compared to the previous sections. I mean, this comes out of nowhere. You're just reading along. You can see that he's praising God and he's meditating on God's greatness and omniscience. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he says, "Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of bloodshed, depart from me." And it sounds like he's just completely abandoned his theme. He's just totally changed his subject. But then you read the next verse, and you see what he's really getting at here. For they speak against you wickedly, and your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? Do I not revile those who rise up against you? I hate them with the utmost hatred. They have become my enemies. If this is David writing, he's not talking about Absalom. He's not talking about King Saul. He's talking about those who are wicked, those who rebel against God. And you see, he's not talking about the things that he personally feels anger and hatred about. He is seeking to align his will with God's. Our insufficiency contrasts very sharply with God's all-sufficiency. He's ever-present. He's all-knowing. And only his wisdom is worth heeding. And so he concludes, if you are so great and you know everything, and I am so small and I really know nothing, then what could possibly be better for me to do than to just stick with what you say? To listen to your words when you tell me what's right and you tell me what's wrong. In verse 1, he says, O Lord, you have searched me and known me. And here at the end, in verse 23, he submits to this. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. And see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. He calls for God to cross-examine him. He calls for God to correct him. This isn't easy. This isn't necessarily enjoyable. But he calls for God to search him and to know him. May we do the same.